The Israel that many picture, a land of abundance and peace, is far from the truth. Most people who lived there before biblical times died before they turned 30. Life was hard, and just surviving each day was a constant battle. Water, essential for life, was scarce and incredibly valuable. Entire families would fight fiercely over a single well, treating it like the most precious treasure imaginable. The lack of resources was only one part of their hardship. The social and religious system was strict and unforgiving. Even breaking a minor religious law could lead to severe punishment, with public stoning being the most common penalty. How could a place called the land flowing with milk and honey actually be one of the harshest environments in the ancient world? And even more perplexing, why would millions of people choose to live there, facing such adversity with courage and unwavering faith? The answer lies in Israel's strategic location and its geographic conditions, but also in a dark secret that's rarely discussed. Israel was situated at the crossroads of three continents: Africa, Asia, and Europe. It was a meeting point for civilizations and empires, where trade routes intersected and the destinies of different peoples were shaped. This was a land of stark contrasts, a geopolitical battleground that, for centuries, would determine the course of the ancient world. But what many people don't realize is that the Promised Land was actually a harsh and arid place, a desert disguised as a land of hope. The landscape was dry and unforgiving. The land stretched out into vast deserts, like the Negev in the south, where the intense heat scorched everything in its path. In contrast, the north offered a brief respite with the hills of Galilee, where olive trees and vineyards somehow managed to survive, though not without great difficulty. During the summer, the heat was unbearable. Temperatures often soared above 104 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Celsius, with the sun beating down on the parched earth, making it almost barren. When it did rain, it was infrequent and never enough to alleviate the water shortage that plagued the region. During the winter, the climate became somewhat milder, but rainfall was still scarce, and the water sources rarely provided enough for the population. Traveling between cities was a massive challenge. The roads were narrow and dangerous, and a trip from Jerusalem to Galilee could take an entire week. It was a journey filled with uncertainty and risk. The constant threat of bandits and lurking wild animals turned every trip into a gamble with your life. And then there was the water, the most precious and highly contested resource. The Promised Land, described as flowing with milk and honey, was actually thirsty, and without water, survival was impossible. Wells were more valuable than gold, and any cistern built required meticulous care because it held the key to life itself. Cisterns were more than just water reservoirs. They were fortresses against death and despair. The irony of life in the Promised Land is devastating. For many, wine mixed with water was the daily drink, not for pleasure, but out of necessity. Pure water was often contaminated and unsafe to drink, making diluted wine a safer, though less appealing, alternative. This was the reality for those trying to live there, a constant struggle balancing faith, endurance, and the basic fight for survival. And yet, millions still tried to live, work, raise families, and maintain their faith. Amid all of this hardship, a chosen people believed that God's promise of a land of abundance wasn't just a distant dream, but a reality to be seized. For many, it was a test of their faith, a demonstration of their perseverance in the face of seemingly impossible odds. It was a life woven with suffering and adversity in a land where each day could easily be your last. It was here, in this unwelcoming and challenging environment, that the history of the people of Israel unfolded, a land that promised blessings but demanded blood, sweat, and tears just to witness another sunrise. This was the harsh reality of life in the Promised Land. Each day began with a fight for survival, and simply waking up was a challenge in itself. It marked the start of a daily journey where physical and mental exertion were intertwined, where every action was dictated by the need to keep breathing, to live another day. Waking up in an Israelite home wasn't a matter of choice. It was a conscious decision rooted in faith and the will to survive. The dawn, with the sun rising around 6 a.m., was a constant reminder that there was no room for luxury in daily life. The sun wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was a gift of time that couldn't be wasted. Every ray of light represented an opportunity to work, to produce, to fight for sustenance. It was a matter of survival. The day only held value while the sun was in the sky because the night was long and dangerous, and the darkness in the Promised Land often meant the risk of death. The daily work of an Israelite centered around three essential activities frequently mentioned in the Bible: farming, shepherding, and, in the north around the Sea of Galilee, fishing. These were the activities that sustained life and fed families. Yet all were constantly threatened by one relentless enemy: the lack of water. Every minute of sunlight, every hour of the day, was dedicated to the continuous effort to find food and sustenance. In the lives of fishermen, as depicted in Mark 1 verse 16, where Jesus calls Simon and Andrew, two brothers who were fishermen, it's important to note that these men worked the waters of the Sea of Galilee, a region which, as beautiful and fertile as it was, still relied on careful management of its natural resources. But what many people don't fully appreciate is how the scarcity of water shaped every aspect of daily existence. Water wasn't a luxury. It was the very essence of survival. And the cisterns described in Jeremiah 2 verse 13 were the unsung heroes of this struggle: rock-hewn reservoirs, deep pits carved into the earth to collect and store rainwater. The fate of every family literally depended on how much rain had fallen during the previous winter. These cisterns weren't just physical components of daily life. They were a direct reflection of the constant battle to stay alive. What most people fail to realize is that the scarcity of water even influenced clothing. Everyday attire was simple and practical. The Bible describes the use of linen tunics and leather sandals, garments that became symbols of both humility and necessity. In Matthew 10 verse 10, Jesus mentions that it wasn't necessary to carry an extra tunic when traveling because the simplicity of their clothing made life more functional and efficient. Food also reflected this austere reality. Bread was the true staple, the foundation of every meal. In Matthew 6 verse 11, in the famous "Give us this day our daily bread" prayer, we see a testament to this essential dependence. Each family ground wheat at home using a stone hand mill, a grueling process that consumed hours of work each day. Meat, on the other hand, was a rarity, as illustrated in the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15. Killing a fattened calf to celebrate the return of the lost son was an extraordinary occasion. Meat was a luxury, a special dish reserved for truly important events. Then there was the Sabbath, the sacred day of rest. The truth about the Sabbath is, in itself, quite shocking. It was taken so seriously that violating its rules could result in the death penalty, as stated in Exodus 31 verse 14. On the Sabbath, one couldn't light a fire, carry a load, or even walk long distances. Israelite society was deeply defined by faith and the need to obey divine commandments, with the unwavering belief that any violation of these laws wasn't simply a social offense, but a direct affront to God Himself. What enabled these people to endure such harsh and difficult conditions? The answer, once again, lies in their absolute faith that this land held a divine purpose. Despite it being one of the most challenging regions in the ancient world, where every day was a fight for survival, the conviction that God had promised this land as an inheritance to His people gave them the strength to persevere. Faith sustained them, providing the assurance that all the hardships and challenges they faced would be rewarded by the divine presence that guided and protected each believer. And in the end, that land, which seemed cruel and unforgiving, became the stage where some of the greatest acts of faith in history were forged, where survival was inextricably linked to belief in a higher divine purpose. But this faith would be tested even more intensely when the people of Israel reached the most significant and contradictory city in the biblical world, Jerusalem. Can you imagine a day of the week when working could literally cost you your life? In biblical Israel, the Sabbath wasn't just a day of rest. It was a matter of life and death. Exodus 31 verse 14 makes this unequivocally clear. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. This wasn't simply a religious command, but a rule so strict that it surpassed both spiritual and social boundaries. The Sabbath completely transformed the lives of the Israelites, beginning at sunset on Friday and lasting until sunset on Saturday. During those 24 hours, daily activities were reduced to an almost absolute minimum. Lighting a fire was forbidden, so all food had to be prepared in advance. Carrying a load was prohibited, even a small one. No one could walk more than about a kilometer from their home. The Sabbath imposed a deep silence, a stillness that enveloped the entire land of Israel, with every movement carefully controlled, life itself becoming an act of obedience and reverence toward divine law. But while the Sabbath set the rhythm of daily life, the center of Israel's religious and spiritual existence was in an even more impressive place, the Temple of Jerusalem. The temple wasn't just a place of prayer. It was the very heart of Israel's social, economic, and spiritual life. All aspects of Israelite life converged there, often in stark contradictions. The temple was not only a place of devotion, but also a bustling commercial hub, a court of law, and even a slaughterhouse, all rolled into one. And when we describe it as a slaughterhouse, The description is quite literal. Sacrifices took place constantly and on a massive scale. During Passover, for example, historians estimate that around 250,000 lambs were sacrificed within just a few days. The smell of blood and burning meat filled the air around the temple, becoming an inescapable part of life for anyone living nearby or passing through. In 2 Kings 16 verse 13, we find detailed descriptions of the different types of daily sacrifices performed at the temple, including burnt offerings, grain offerings, and drink offerings. The noise was deafening. The sounds of animals bleating, loud prayers, and a constant crackling of fire. For Israelite children, this environment was familiar from their earliest years. They grew up breathing the atmosphere of sacrifices, rituals, and devotion. As described in Deuteronomy 6 verses 6 to 7, children were taught to memorize the Torah and to speak of it at all times. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. For them, the Word of God wasn't a distant theory or a vague tradition. It was lived intensely every day, a manual for life, a constant presence in every thought and every action. But if you love seeing the Bible come alive through the lens of history, make sure to subscribe to Bible and Histories, like, and share to help spread these timeless sacred mysteries. Imagine 5- or 6-year-old children reciting entire psalms from memory, knowing every law, every ritual, every religious feast in detail. Religious education began long before they could even walk steadily or fully understand the world around them. The strictness of religious life was absolute. The Israelites believed with unwavering conviction that they were God's chosen people living in the Promised Land. And this certainty sustained them amid the hardships and severity of their existence. At the heart of this rigid and deeply religious world was a city that concentrated all this faith and hope in an even more intense and contradictory way. Jerusalem was the city that embodied both the best and the worst of humanity's relationship with the divine. Can you imagine a city where the smell of blood mixed with incense dominated the air every single day? Jerusalem in the time of Jesus was exactly that, a holy city that was also an immense religious slaughterhouse. The first thing that impressed visitors was the grand architecture of Jerusalem. The city was built in layers, with stone houses stacked upon one another, connected by endless stairways. As Luke 19 verse 41 describes, Jesus wept when he saw the city from above, reflecting on its fate. From a distance, one saw a majestic city dominated by the figure of the temple rising in splendor, commanding the entire skyline. This temple, built by Herod, was one of the most magnificent structures of the ancient world. It was the center of all attention, the place where religious traditions and sacrifices intertwined with the daily lives of a deeply devout people. Yet, even as it stood as a symbol of unwavering faith, it was also the site where human contradictions were laid bare, where the blood of animals mingled with incense, and where, under the shadow of holiness, the suffering of endless sacrifices continued without pause. But here's what few people realize. Ordinary people never had access to the temple itself. They were confined to the outer courts. The Temple of Jerusalem, with all its grandeur, was a place reserved for a select few. For the common people, the temple was a distant place of worship, with the poorest pushed to the outer edges, never allowed into the heart of holiness. Biblical Jerusalem was a city of stark contrasts, a place where the sacred and the profane coexisted in a visible, painful way. In the markets, everything was for sale: spices from India, fabrics from Egypt, jewels from Arabia. Commerce bustled at every moment. Mark 11 verses 15 to 17 records the moment when Jesus drove the merchants out of the temple courts, accusing them of turning what should be a sacred space into a marketplace. But for every prosperous merchant, there were dozens of beggars at the gates, living in misery. Luke 16 verse 20 tells of Lazarus, a beggar covered in sores who lived at the gate of a rich man, a reflection of the sad reality of many in Jerusalem, where wealth and poverty existed side by side, separated by an invisible, impenetrable line. Everywhere, Roman soldiers patrolled. They stood on street corners, monitored the markets, collected taxes with violence, and spread fear. Matthew 5 verse 41 refers to the Roman law that allowed soldiers to force any Jew to carry their baggage for 1 mile. This was no metaphor, but an actual law, a daily and systematic humiliation for the Jewish people. Imagine the suffering of a poor Jewish vendor trying to sell his fruit at the market while a Roman soldier passed by, mocking his goods. It was constant humiliation, the power of the oppressor over the oppressed. The social hierarchy was clearly visible. Priests, with their colorful and ornate garments, walked through the center of the city, while ordinary people wore simple, faded tunics. The social distance between them wasn't just a matter of status. It was a matter of life and death, of who had the right to human dignity and who was treated as property. But if all this already sounds cruel, the worst was yet to come when it came to daily life in Jerusalem. Where did people relieve themselves? Public latrines were rare. Most of the population used areas outside the city walls, turning the surroundings of Jerusalem into a permanently unsanitary zone, a land of filth and suffering. During days of extreme heat, families would go up to the flat rooftops of their houses to sleep. Acts 10 verse 9 mentions Peter praying on the rooftop of a house, and it was common practice to use these spaces as extra rooms during the intense summer heat. Life in Jerusalem was marked by extreme contrasts. The sacred and the profane mingled. Wealth and poverty existed side by side. Faith and oppression walked the same stone-paved streets. If you thought the social tensions of Jerusalem were intense, wait until you discover how Israelite society really functioned and how being born into the right family or the wrong gender could determine not only your future, but even your very humanity. Did you know that in biblical Israel, the social group you were born into determined whether you would be treated as a human being or as property? Israelite society was divided into rigid layers, and crossing those barriers was impossible. At the top of the pyramid were the Sadducees, the religious elite who controlled the temple and its sacred practices. They were the only ones with direct access to the holiest rituals and, not coincidentally, were also the wealthiest. Acts 5 verse 17 shows us how the Sadducees persecuted any threat to their power and influence. They were in charge, and their wealth and authority were not only financial, but also spiritual. Just below them came the Pharisees, a group Matthew 23 verse 5 describes as people who make their phylacteries broad and the fringes of their garments long, obsessed with displaying their religiosity in public, a spectacle of faith that often hid hypocrisy. They saw themselves as the legitimate religious authority, but in reality, they were more concerned with appearances than with true transformation of the heart. For most of the population, however, farmers, fishermen, artisans, life was very different. They worked hard with little to sustain their families, and their faith was often a refuge amid the daily struggle for survival. But for women, reality was even more tragic. From birth, they were subjected to an oppressive patriarchal system in which their words had no legal value. They could not testify in court, and formal religious education in the synagogues was forbidden to them. Women were viewed as property, and their lives were often defined by arranged marriages at the age of 12 or 13. These marriages weren't personal choices, but commercial transactions between families, as seen implicitly in Matthew 1 verse 18, where Mary was already betrothed to Joseph. For women, life was a continuous fight for dignity and respect in a world that saw them as inferior, as commodities rather than human beings. When a woman was caught in adultery, the reality was brutal. John 8 verses 4 to 5 shows how she was publicly dragged out to be stoned to death. But there is something even more perverse in this story. Only the woman was brought to justice. The man involved was rarely punished. Gender inequality was blatant and cruel. Women were seen as property, and their lives could be destroyed by a single mistake, while men, with rare exceptions, escaped punishment. But women weren't the only victims of this cruel system. Widows, in particular, were exposed to social humiliation. Mark 12 verse 40 denounces the scribes, those religious leaders who devour widows' houses. When a husband died, many women were literally abandoned by society, without inheritance, without protection, and without dignity. They were left at the mercy of anyone and often ended up living in absolute poverty. The treatment of widows in Israelite society was a reflection of the deep contempt for the fragility and vulnerability of women. Now, if being a woman was already difficult, being a Samaritan was even worse. The Samaritans were considered impure, traitors to the Jewish faith, half Jewish, half Gentile. They were seen as a marginalized people rejected by Jewish traditions. John 4 verse 9 describes the astonishment of the Samaritan woman when speaking to Jesus. "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. There was total segregation. The Jews avoided traveling through Samaritan lands, detouring their routes so as not to touch the contaminated soil. Sharing food or drink with a Samaritan was seen as spiritual defilement. This racial and religious divide was severe and almost impossible to overcome. At the very bottom of the social pyramid were the poor, the masses who survived from day to day with no guarantees, no hope. Luke 16 verses 19 to 21 paints this harsh and inescapable reality. While some were clothed in purple and fine linen, others, like Lazarus, lay covered with sores, longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. The gap between social classes was not only economic, but also a matter of basic human dignity. For the poor, daily survival was a battle against humiliation, hunger, and inequality. While the elite lived in luxury, crumbs of bread were the only hope for the most needy. All this social oppression became even more brutal when you realized who truly ruled Israel. The ones who really controlled the people's lives were not the religious leaders or the local nobles, but the Romans, who had imposed a foreign occupation that turned Israel into a puppet state completely submissive to Rome. Life under Roman occupation was a hell of heavy taxes and constant humiliation. Imagine living in a country where foreign soldiers could force you to carry their luggage whenever they pleased. This was the daily reality for Jews under Roman rule. Matthew 5 verse 41 records the words of Jesus, "If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles." This was not just spiritual advice, but a matter of practical survival. What Jesus was saying was that if you wanted to avoid being humiliated or punished, you should comply with the oppressor's demands and even go beyond what was required to prevent further abuse. The truth is, the Romans turned Israel into a submissive nation where the people's dignity was at the mercy of foreign authorities. Taxes were brutal and humiliating, levied on practically everything, on land, on crops, on trade, on nearly everything you owned. Matthew 17 verse 24 mentions one of these taxes, the temple tax, but there were many others that people had to pay just to survive. And who collected these taxes? Other Jews. Luke 19 verse 2 introduces Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector, who collected taxes for Rome, betraying his own people. Tax collectors were hated even more than the Romans themselves because they were seen as collaborators with the oppressor, exploiting their own brothers in the name of a system that oppressed them. They were traitors to the nation, seeing their own people as a source of profit to be mercilessly exploited. Imagine a Jewish farmer who had worked tirelessly all year on his small piece of land only to see most of his harvest taken away by tax collectors. These collectors spoke the same language as he did, but served the empire that enslaved him. It was a constant cycle of oppression, a people struggling to live while distant and relentless external forces took what rightfully belonged to them. Revolts were frequent, but they almost always ended the same way: mass crucifixion. Roman crucifixion was not just an execution. It was a tool of psychological terror. The empire used crosses to spread fear and to show who was in control. The Romans crucified rebels along major roads so that everyone passing by would see the horrific public punishment. Josephus, the historian of the time, recounts an event so terrible that, during one revolt, so many people were crucified that there was not enough wood for the crosses, nor enough crosses for the bodies. Crucifixion became a spectacle of pain and humiliation where resistance was crushed not only physically but also psychologically, with the body of anyone who dared challenge the empire's power left exposed to shame and suffering. Luke 13 verse 1 mentions the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices, a reference to a brutal massacre. If you love seeing the Bible come alive through the lens of history, make sure to subscribe to Bible and Histories, like, and share to help spread these timeless sacred mysteries. Roman soldiers even desecrated the very temple during religious observances. They stormed in and slaughtered Jews while they were in the midst of worship, defiling the sacred space with the blood of their own kin. The violence became so commonplace and so intensely brutal that the temple, intended as a symbol of faith and holiness, was transformed into a site of martyrdom and profound humiliation. The situation was utterly dire, the oppression felt unending, and the desperate search for any sign of hope became a vital necessity. Faith, though remaining strong, was tested to its absolute limits. John 6 verse 15 tells us that after Jesus miraculously multiplied the loaves of bread, the hungry and deeply oppressed crowd wanted to seize him and forcibly make him their king. Why such a strong reaction? It was because a people who were both hungry and oppressed were desperate for any semblance of a deliverer. They yearned for someone who could liberate them from their hunger and suffering, someone who would finally break the Roman yoke and restore their inherent dignity and freedom. In this turbulent climate, false messiahs began to emerge, preying on the people's hopes. Acts 5 verses 36 to 37 mentions figures like Theudas and Judas the Galilean, both of whom promised liberation and managed to gather sizable followings. However, like all the others, they ultimately met a tragic end, dying alongside their devoted followers. Their promises proved empty, and the people's hope was once again brutally shattered. Those who still managed to cling to hope were not simply looking for a political leader or a military liberator. They were longing for the promised Messiah, the one who would finally restore the kingdom of Israel to its former glory. What sustained this unwavering hope was an unshakable faith that God had not abandoned his people, even amidst the taunting presence of Roman soldiers, the pervasive greed of tax collectors, and the constant, grim sight of crosses lining the roads. The people of Israel firmly believed that at some point, God would send his chosen one to deliver them from their brutal oppression and restore the kingdom to its rightful place. Daniel 2 verse 44 further fueled this enduring hope, proclaiming that the God of heaven would establish a kingdom that would never be destroyed. This powerful vision of an eternal kingdom, completely free from the control of foreign empires, served as the light at the end of a very long tunnel for millions of Jews, who, when they looked at their present circumstances, saw only darkness, relentless suffering, and abject slavery. But the story of Israel does not end with crosses, relentless oppression, or humiliating defeat. Even in the face of such immense adversity, the flame of hope never completely died out. The Jewish people, marked by both pain and remarkable resilience, steadfastly kept alive the deep-seated belief that one day, the promised Messiah would indeed come. The promise of an eternal kingdom, the complete restoration of Israel, was not merely a fleeting idea, but a profound truth deeply embedded in the very soul of every Israelite. And when the Messiah finally did arrive, his appearance was not what many had anticipated. He did not come as a military leader, a powerful king, or a fierce liberator who would crush their enemies with brute force. Instead, Jesus of Nazareth came as a humble man, preaching a message of love, peace, and salvation, while also challenging the corrupt power structures that oppressed his people. He was not the Messiah that many had expected, but he was undoubtedly the Messiah that God had promised. His life, his death, and his resurrection became the bedrock of the Christian faith and a reaffirmation of the enduring hope that the Jewish people had always held dear. Jerusalem, this sacred city that was nonetheless marked by profound suffering, would become the stage for an event that would forever alter the course of human history. The Messiah did not come merely to restore the physical kingdom of Israel to its former glory. He came to inaugurate a spiritual kingdom that would transcend all borders and ages, ultimately reaching all nations across the globe. The crucifixion, which initially appeared to be the most humiliating defeat imaginable, would in fact become the ultimate and resounding victory over death and sin. This story is not solely about the suffering of a people or the promise of a deliverer. It is about the radical transformation of humanity. It is about how faith, hope, and love can endure and even thrive in the most desperate of circumstances. Israel, the promised land, with all its stark contrasts, inherent hardships, and ongoing struggles, became the cradle of a story that would eventually touch the entire world. And so, the land that witnessed the fulfillment of divine promises, that endured the immense pain of the cross, and then experienced the unparalleled joy of the resurrection, continues to stand as a powerful symbol of unwavering faith, remarkable resilience, and enduring renewal. In its seemingly dry soil, at the very heart of its complex history, a radiant light was born. A light that continues to shine brightly in every corner of the world, because hope truly never dies. It renews, it resurrects, and it transforms. See you soon. If this video inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Bible and Histories, where faith meets the past and reveals the future.